Welcome, everyone. You can hear? Ed, can you hear? Okay, if you can hear, we're golden. Welcome, and thank you for coming on this drizzly, rainy day on a March afternoon on Sunday. It is so wonderful to see you here. My name is Diane Proctor, and I serve on the Concord Carlisle League of Women Voters Board, which allows me the privilege of moderating this important discussion this afternoon. At a time, hi Dina, at a time when the world is on fire. I was at a service yesterday for a beloved person here in Concord, and the minister started by saying the world is on fire. And I think, in fact, that couldn't be more apt. We are gathered to examine the complexity of the modern media landscape. Specifically, we will discuss the question, who safeguards the truth, and how do they manage that? By examining print, social media, and some broadcasting. When President Trump took office again in 2024, and this is something we all know, he stripped public television and radio of federal resources. And so it leans on us, in fact, to provide those resources in order to keep that going. In a market as robust as Boston, that's less challenging than in more rural areas where gathering such resources may be a more fragile endeavor. And just last weekend, he did this just for us, so that when we gathered together, we'd have something feisty to discuss. Just last weekend, President Trump accused several news organizations, again, of being fake news media. Of course, this is nothing new. We have grown accustomed to such proclamations. Nonetheless, he claimed on Truth Social, that the news organizations, which he does not embrace, are doing terrible reporting on the Iran conflict and in causing damage to the United States. And that's something we can discuss in particular why he fulminated on that particular point. But rather than just letting the president vent, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, chair Brendan Carr, remember that name, Brendan Carr, jumped into the fray by issuing a threat. Here's what he said. Broadcasters, and this is my addition, and by extension, all media, he didn't say that, I did, just to be, since we're talking about truth, I want to make it clear that's not what he said, that's what I added. Broadcasters, and by extension, all media, that are running hoaxes and news distortions, also known as, this is right from Carr's mouth, also known as the fake news, have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. The law is clear. Broadcasters must operate in the public interest. Wonder how we define public interest. And they will lose their licenses if they do not. And they will lose their licenses if they do not. To put Chairman Carr's statement plainly, if the current administration perceives broadcast news reporting as misinformation, then those broadcast licenses are at risk. This should remind Americans that letting the government decide what information may be shared and what counts as truth is a perilous game. Implicit as well is the willingness of the government to sue media outlets of one kind or another when they broadcast or when they write about, when they promote perspectives with which, for one reason or another, they disagree. This discussion about fake news led me to find the actual assumptions that govern the FCC, which, according to the New York Times, is, quote, the FCC is designed to be independent stewards of the public interest, guardians against monopolies, fraud, and the misuse of the public airways. When those requirements were pointed out to Carr, remember our Brendan Carr guy, pointed out to Brendan Carr, he said, speaking officially before the Senate Commerce Committee, well, actually, formally speaking, the FCC isn't independent. The next day, the word independent was scrubbed from the SCC's mission statement page, signaling, as the Times noted, quote, that the FCC has become an extension of presidential power. Welcome, Kate, and what beautiful flowers. In a world, therefore, looking more like Alice's than our own, in which everything has become curiouser and curiouser, I am tempted to cite the Queen when she says to Alice, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. How many of us have woken up and thought, what? It's not possible. A sensation that is all too familiar when reading the morning papers and editorials or hearing a report or a podcast. And when Alice cries, I don't want to go among mad people. Oh, that can't be helped, says the Cheshire Cat. We're all mad here. Alice sighs, oh, it would be so nice if something made sense for a change. In our quest to discern good sense and truth, we have 2 impressive and experienced writers and scholars with us to discuss reality. After each has spoken, I will then ask them some questions, leaving ample time for questions and answers from all of you and people who are joining us online. So there'll be lots of opportunities for really good back and forth discourse. Danielle Allen, if I were to list all of Danielle Allen's attributes, I would need 5 pages of materials. I mean, she is, in fact, a model for me and a phenom in our world. She is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard University. She is also director of the Allen Lab for Democracy, Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School, and director of the Democratic Knowledge Project entitled Learn. Don't you love that title, Learn? A research lab focused on civic education, a seasoned nonprofit leader. She is a vigorous ethicist and advocate for democracy. She was, and underscore the past tense, she was a contributing editor at the Washington Post and remains an essayist for the Atlantic magazine and for the New York Times and for other venues. She now writes a regular blog on something called The Renovator and has a monthly podcast, which I have found engaging. And in case you did not notice, the man sitting here is not Scott Lehigh. No way. He is Frank Phillips. Scott wrote me on Friday saying that he has a family emergency and is unable to join us. It was, in truth, Frank who led us to Scott originally, and Frank has valiantly stepped in. Another truth. I must confess, we have quietly elevated this event with Frank's presence. So thank you, Frank. Frank knows of what he speaks. He lives in Concord and was with his wife Janice, and was for many years the storied State House bureau chief for the Globe. For 31 years. I corrected my 30 years to 31 this morning. He continues to serve as a freelance writer. He wrote unflinchingly about the political world and has consistently garnered broad journalistic respect. So we welcome Danielle, we welcome Frank. They're going to make a few comments, each actually from the chair, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll turn it over to everybody else. Does that work for everybody? Yes? Okay, here we go. All right.
Thank you so much, Diane. It's always such a pleasure to be in Concord, and especially with the League of Women Voters in Concord and Carlisle. And Diane knows, if Diane asks, I always say yes. So I know I've been here before, and I appreciate the warm welcome Diane always provides. I'm going to tell a few stories that... Right, hold the microphone close. Okay. I'm going to tell a few stories as a way of simply reflecting on the journey that we've all had with truth over the last 2 decades. And it really is, for me, it has been, roughly speaking, 2 decades journey of trying to think about, intentionally and self-consciously, the place of truth in the public sphere. It's, in some sense, I suppose, not surprising that our current politics is so dominated by falsehood, given that the really strong rupture of our politics from truth happened in the 2007-2008 election, when Barack Obama was running and our now President Trump was among the most active exponents of the falsehood that Barack Obama was a Muslim. You'll remember that. And that occasion was actually the point at which I became connected with the Washington Post. I was watching these falsehoods circulate. I was in the fall of 2007 a volunteer with the Obama campaign. I was a field organizer with the Obama campaign. I had taken a leave of absence from my academic job to do that. And I was watching these falsehoods circulate. The mainstream media was, by and large, keeping their hands clear of them. They were of the view, that's junk. We don't deal with junk. We should just ignore it. It will go away. It will sort of wash itself out of the system. But I was also a scholar, political scientist, so I was paying really careful attention to polling and just how polling was working. And it was very clear that the false rumors were moving the needle on polls, that they were harming Obama's polling quite immediately and directly. So my view was you couldn't ignore these kinds of falsehoods any longer simply because they were false. They had become a political force despite their falsehood. So I did an investigative process and sort of tracked down the original sources of the rumors and so forth and brought their names into public view and sort of forced coverage of what was happening with the rumors. And I was very proud of myself. I thought I'd done a good thing. And I thought, well, now we've got it solved. Our media ecosystem is going to be just fine because mainstream media is going to track down these people one by one, and we're going to get all those rumors cleaned up and so on. So obviously that was wrong. That was the wrong way to think about where we are headed. And then I made a second mistake.
Optimistic and valiant, but not wrong.
Well, that was very kind, Diane. I appreciate that. But I continued to think, as did many around me, in a similar vein for the subsequent few years. And just a few years later, an entity that you may still know called PolitiFact came into existence. This was a creation of St. Petersburg Times in Florida. They had sort of followed that lead of that early moment of deciding that we had to fact check these Obama rumors, and they started deciding to try to fact check a lot of the junk that was coming out. And it was hard work. They set up a whole new editorial process. It was a new kind of feature for newsrooms to have, sort of brand new aspect of journalism. Essentially what they were doing was taking the internal fact-checking processes of a newsroom that were a basic part of the profession and making them itself the thing that they were giving to readers instead of simply giving readers stories. And I was serving on the Pulitzer Prize board at the time of PolitiFact's emergence. And so we had an incredibly heated debate inside the Pulitzer Prize boardroom the year that PolitiFact was first nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, which was only a year or two into its existence. And we awarded it a prize. And again, in a sort of similar vein, where we were thinking, what we really have to do is beef up this fact-checking function, because if we could just beef up the fact-checking function enough, we're going to really be able to get that, this problem of misinformation and disinformation under control. And again, we were wrong. So we all know where things have trended, that misinformation and disinformation have simply proliferated. At this point, with the emergence of AI, we live in a world where essentially we have to function as if we presume most things to be false first and wait for things to be proved to be true or accurate. And that really just flips on its head, sort of our paradigm for how we think about truth in the public sphere, and raises a very significant question for how can we have healthy information ecosystems. I'll just say a couple of things here to seed the conversation that I'm sure will pursue these lines. One critical idea is that we have to actually approach sort of this world as one where we have to inoculate ourselves against misinformation and disinformation. So rather than, again, expecting that what we generally have is a world full of truthful information and maybe there's some bad stuff, we have to presume it's all bad and be prepared to know how to sort out good from bad. And so that's what it means to try to inoculate yourself. It's a different approach, for example, to educating young people about the digital universe. We have often talked about educating for media literacy. There's a shift in the field to talking about educating for digital competence. And what this means is making sure that young people know how to use all the tools that might, in fact, be used against them. If you know what you can make with these tools, then you are inoculated against the many fabrications that could be sent your direction. But it's a real sort of shift of mental model for how one interacts with what is being sent to us now. There are two other things that we can do. One is a policy matter. There's an important piece of policy called Section 230 of the Internet Communications Decency Act. This was a provision that exempted social media platforms from any liability for anything that appears on their platforms. And this was done on First Amendment grounds. But the mistake that was made was to fail to recognize that social media platforms are publishers. They are making editorial decisions. They are doing that through how they structure algorithms. They should be no more exempt for their publication decisions through their algorithms than any other publisher is. So there's a sort of policy movement to try to get rid of Section 230 so that social media platforms can be held liable for the algorithms. Those algorithms can affect whether or not the really bad junk whose purpose is deception, outrage, fraud, and the like is elevated or not. So there is a pathway there. The second pathway that matters, and this is what I spend a lot of my time on, as you know, is actually changing incentives in our election system. I'm an advocate for a ballot initiative here in Massachusetts to get rid of party primaries, to replace them with an all-party primary. When you have that kind of method, candidates have to campaign to the whole electorate, and they have to win 50% of the vote. So they have an incentive, actually, that pushes them more towards positive campaigning as opposed to negative campaigning. The party primary system, which sort of separates the electorate and fragments the electorate, really rewards negative campaigning. When you have structures that reward positive campaigning, you actually have politicians who are incentivized to do a better job of actually cleaning up the information ecosystem themselves, focus more on issues, less on ad hominem and things like that. There are other kinds of changes you can make too, to things like our election systems to give people different incentives for how they communicate. So that would be the third bucket that I would point to, sort of what we can do about our situation. So inoculating ourselves through a different approach to education around digital competence, policy changes so that we can actually hold platform companies liable, and then changing incentives for communicators in our election system. So I'll lay that out as some starting thoughts and look forward to the conversation.
You know, Danielle, just very quickly, I noticed that in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, that the president, I guess the Department of Justice, is suing Apple because they are allowing certain things on their platform which they believe are disinformation. So we've got two forces coming at that, don't we? One from one side and one from the other. Interesting to see how that gets adjudicated. Frank.
Yes. Is that on? Hi. I got into the news business back pre-Watergate. I'd been overseas in the Peace Corps, settled here in Concord on the way. I was back here. I'd been an activist kid in the civil rights movement. I went down south registering voters.
Can everybody hear him back there? Okay.
Right
there is just
close.
That close?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. But I wanted to go to law school, be a civil rights lawyer, but it was the winter time, and I found... So I found myself, my brother-in-law was down in Providence being a reporter. He said, you got to do this. You got to do this. So I went up to Lowell, Massachusetts, and I walked into this newsroom, and I had an interview with an old city managing editor. I said I couldn't tape. He said, don't worry about it. You'll learn. This grungy newsroom, clattering all over. I was Jesus, this is overwhelming for me. But I walked into that next day, and he said, sit over there. There's your typewriter. I practiced all weekend trying to, find the keys. Here's the keys. I sat down. I've had it down. And sorry.
That's okay.
And they shot me down at a typewriter, bank of typewriter. Jack Kerouac used these typewriters. I said, oh, geez, this is great. So I sat down, I had all the keys ready, looked down at the typewriter, all the keys are wiped, half the keys are wiped off. The guy gives me an assignment to do, and I'm looking down at what am I going to do? But long story short, I had a great time at the Lowell Sun. It was gave me an ability to really, and I finally got into being the City Hall reporter. I was the investigative reporter, and the paper was really, it was pro-war, Vietnam War. It was very conservative, but on the local side, it was great anti-corruption campaigns and stood for a lot of good things. And I got a call one day. It was a squeaky voice on the other line, said, hi, this is Paul Songas. I was in the Peace Corps. You were in the Peace Corps. let's get together. And that began a long relationship, very close relationship. And he and I would sit around his office, snapping elastics at the ceiling, trying to figure out the next way we can clean up City Hall. I had a wonderful time in Lowell, and it was newspapering at its best. And it breaks my heart to see what goes on now. These cities, Lowell, all the great newspapers around Massachusetts, Quincy, New Bedford, there were all the feeding papers for the Boston Herald, the Boston Record, and the Globe to a great extent. And journalism was at its height back in the late 60s, into 70s, and the 80s. And it's sadly down to almost nothing in terms of, you go into the State House now, and it used to buzz with all kinds of reporters running all over the place. There's a big room about this size where it was just filled with reporters. A lot of, people are banging around on typewriters, UPI, AP machine, ding, 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 ding. There was a lot of buzz going on. And I went in there the other day, last year, for an event, and I went up to the room. There was one person in this cavernous room, and it broke my heart. It broke my heart, but it also made me think about where journalism is now, and knowing firsthand how important it has been. My covering the State House for so many years, or covering City Hall in Lowell, we're doing investigative work at both the Globe and the Lowell Sun. Our papers were our democracy, and they are now just a shell of themselves, except the Globe is struggling, it's doing well, it has made the transition fairly well. But it's different journalism, it's different politics than it has been for, when I came into this business. I think, is that?
Our papers were, I was trying to write it down, excuse me. Our papers were our democracy. I mean, what a powerful phrase. I mean, that's exactly it, isn't it? I mean, it's the fourth estate. In France, and in 1776, and that period when there was a revolution, the first estate, and most of us might think that the first estate was the king. Well, actually, it was the clergy. The second estate was the king, and the third estate was, for the first time, in that famous oath of the tennis court, when there was a real attempt to bring plebeian and regular voices, to the discussion. In the oath of the tennis court, citizens of France were now asking for some voice in Parliament. And what has kept our rudder straight has been not only that, but the fourth estate. This ability to watch and govern and look over what's happening. First question, Timothy Snyder, we all know Timothy Snyder, right? We've all read, all of his wonderful writing, has warned us not to capitulate in advance. Hold your ground. Yet when writing a piece, indeed, even when preparing remarks for today, were there alternative narratives kind of running through your mind about what to say, what not to say, how not to insult, how maybe getting yourself in trouble, invisible to all of us? Then something is said, right? But was there an interior struggle? I know I had it. Did you? Who wants to take it first?
Sure, no, I'm happy to take that first, Diane. I think you're asking a question about whether or not chilling effects are already operating, so that even if nobody is coming in here yanking us out for our free expression, whether or not there are sort of internal monitors. And the answer is yes. I mean, there's no way for that not to be the case at this point in time, sadly. I'll just tell a few more stories, I suppose, to drive that home, but also maybe try to open it up too. So in 2015, 2016, I used my column at the Post to criticize then candidate Trump. I was one of the first people in September 2015 to say I thought we had to take his candidacy seriously. It was at the point where people were still laughing at it. I was like, don't laugh, people. I hate to tell you, but I think there's a real thing happening here, and it's not good. And so I just sort of hammered every week, for a year on all that I thought was wrong with candidate Trump, which, taught me a lesson about how, fruitless, I suppose, column writing is when you're trying to make a difference. But the one, effect it did have was to really ramp up the amount of hate mail that I was getting. So, just massive amounts of incoming things, images of nooses and gas ovens and really nasty stuff. And then at a certain point, I got put on Charlie Kirk's Professor Watch list. As one of the first people put on that. And that really ratcheted up the death threats, anonymous phone calls and things like that. And so it does have a chilling effect. I mean, it did for me at that time. I found myself, honestly not wanting to go outside. It was really literally affecting me at a quite deep psychological level. And because it was all coming in anonymously, and so you have this sort of feeling, it's like, who hates me? Like, somebody out there hates me, but who is it? I can't tell, sort of in these faces in the crowd, and sort of where are the dangers, and so forth. Now, I don't accept that at the end of the day. At the end of the day, for me, agency, not having that sort of sense of check or limit or block on freedom is just incredibly personally important. So I wasn't willing to live with that sense of limitation or constraint. I asked a friend of mine who has sort of social media archaeology skills to kind of look into it and try to figure out where this was coming from. I suppose that was that same instinct as in the story about the Obama misinformation. Like, I want to know who the source was. So I was going to figure that out, and then I was going to be able to address it. But at any rate, he went away, came back a few weeks later, knocked on my office door and said, Danielle, I've got some news for you. Most of this stuff that you're getting, most of this hate mail is coming from Northern or Central Europe. And I was like, praise be. It's like, I can love my fellow Americans again. But so this was, it was before we all had, before all the official studies by the various national intelligence agencies had been completed. They eventually brought to the surface the fact that there had been a whole lot of sort of Russian-driven troll farms and so forth, whose purpose was to stoke internal division in the U.S. They were particularly pushing on race lines. They were really trying to stoke racial division, and they were targeting black intellectuals, among other things. So that turns out was part of what was happening. But, so then this is going to go a different direction, Diane, from what you were expecting. The result of that, this sort of discovery that most of this stuff was of that kind, and that I could genuinely trust my fellow Americans, because they weren't the ones who were doing this to me, meant that I changed my relationship to all that hate stuff. And I developed the practice, which I use to this day, of it doesn't matter what somebody writes to me, I write back and I say, thank you very much for your kind message. And I say, it sounds like you're concerned about X, because usually there's some little glimmer of a substantive issue in the message. Sounds like you're concerned about X. And then, lo and behold, 9 times out of 10, the person actually writes back and says, yes, I am concerned about that. And I think there was going to be a real person on the other end of this. And then we have a few exchanges, and then eventually they apologize for how they spoke to me. And so that has really changed my attitude towards all of this. So it is a hard world to live in as a writer in the public space. But what that lesson is for me is so much of the negativity that we're experiencing is about the sort of establishment of this kind of expectation of like a culture of nastiness and toxicity and bullying. And it's a kind of expectation that comes with a sense of there not being real relationships at stake. When you can reactivate people's sense that there's a real relationship at stake there, people sort of find again the lessons they were presumably taught as children, right? About how we ought to be able to interact with each other in decent ways. So that was a long-winded way, Diane, of answering your question to say, yes, I mean, there are chilling effects from the national government for sure, and I could speak to those as well. But even more importantly, there are these sort of chilling effects from what I call stochastic harassment. It's sort of like if you say something, if you publish online, you can be guaranteed to get harassing stuff in response. Random in terms of who it's going to be, but you're guaranteed to get something. And then the hard thing to do is to sort of figure out for yourself, like, what's the way out of the trap that creates in terms of the kind of attitudes one then oneself brings to engaging with others.
What's the question? It was fascinating to answer. But
When you were crafting articles for the Globe all
Yeah.
those years. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Here I'm always telling people to get their mic up, and I put mine down. When you were crafting articles for the Globe, like when Charlie Baker, because you did some very poignant writing about Charlie Baker when he was thinking about going for his third term, and noticing funding and what they were doing and everything else. Did you hesitate to write those articles? Was there an interior kind of or what gave you the courage to just tell it like it is?
Never hesitated. I didn't feel there was much courage. It was just what I wanted to do. I came from a political family, and my father was in Philadelphia, my mother was in Boston. They were political families. I grew up with politicians around me. So it was with pleasure that I had a host to expose these, the wrongdoing or the foilabilities of these people. But it was an honor, really, to be a political reporter, whether I was on the Lowell City Hall or the State House or doing investigative work I did for the whole Boston Herald American, going after all kinds of corruption. I loved it, and it was. I never hesitated about it. I wanted to do it. My father was a reformer, took on the Philadelphia Democratic machine, and he was a liberal Democrat, came on, and he would get all kinds of phone calls at night. But I saw it happen, and I wanted to be part of it. And it was, I think the thrill of it was that, one, people had to talk to you, and two, when you walk down the streets, particularly in Lowell, and you wrote about somebody, he'd be screaming at you across the street. Or you go into the city hall, and the clerk would come running out with a paper and say, with expletives coming racing at you. And it was fun. It was great. I had a ball. I couldn't have asked for a better life.
That's so wonderful. Now, if in fact you were doing this today, flash forward, under the kind of constraints that appear to be lively and abroad in the land, would you still see it as fun?
Well,
Or would there be a little caution?
It's hard to say, because I've been out of it for 6 years, and the internet was still, getting involved in politics. But and then I think it would still be there. I did notice that it was getting very nasty, and people were able to get to you through the electronics,
Right.
more than just standing suddenly at the door of the State House bureau.
Or across the street.
or across the street, but worse, standing, some muddy boots, and they're looking at you're looking up at it from your work, and there's some guy yelling at you. Yeah. Well, that's part of the business, and it was a great. You're really having an effect, an impact. More people yell at you, the more you really.
The more impact you're having.
The more impact people are reading you. That's great. We're
Yeah, a
terrific.
direct correlation.
Yeah.
I love it. I recall when President Trump, thank you. I recall when President Trump was first in office, and the New York Times was struggling. I suspect if we all shake off the cobwebs, we'll remember this. When the New York Times was struggling to use the word lie, L-I-E, about what the president was saying. I mean, they didn't want to do it. And to describe some of his statements, and so they kept dancing around it. Do you all remember that? And then finally, rather late in the game, they actually used that word in print, reluctantly and thoughtfully, when they felt they could no longer kind of constrain themselves. The Washington Post did something a little bit different. They created Pinocchios. Did you all follow that for the lie? And so they would give one Pinocchio, two Pinocchios, three Pinocchios, for mistakes that somebody had made, or an untruth that somebody had told. And that became, that was their euphemism for presidential fact checking. What are the ethics right now? There are ethics. What are the ethics that guide, do you think, decisions now when reporting and writing during this complicated time? What do we do? We'll talk about it as individuals, as these, and for you guys in the public domain. What do you do when you confront intellectual dishonesty of one kind or another? What can you do?
And so are you asking specifically about in the case of the president or more generally?
Or
more generally?
Brendan Carr, or
Right.
Pete Hegseth, or I could keep going. With,
Across the board. It's a good question. I mean, so at this point, you were quite right. The New York Times went through a process where they tried very, very hard to avoid calling the president a liar, and then decided that they could no longer avoid it. And probably many of you saw their editorial this past weekend, the entire purpose of which was to catalog the president's lies around Iran. So they have, come all the way over to great comfort and in some sense of responsibility with going ahead and laying out lies. So I guess the kind of writing that I do doesn't typically require me to call out lies. It's just, I'm not covering things. I'm an opinion writer. And so in that regard, I will criticize the president. I suppose I ignore his words, is the short of it. I really just don't bother with his words. I spend most of my time trying to understand his choices, and then commenting on his choices.
As Rachel Maddow always says, ignore the words, follow the action.
Yeah, exactly. So that is roughly speaking how I proceed. And then with regard to other forms of intellectual dishonesty, I mean, I don't take the time, I suppose, to call somebody dishonest or not. I simply show them to be wrong. I take my job to be to sort of show them to be wrong. So that tends to be how I approach it.
I didn't come across that much dishonesty. People tried to spin you, and
Is that a euphemism? Spin you?
yeah, it is. It's although, but anyway, I didn't. People generally, I think Massachusetts politics, while it's rough, it's backstabbing. It's a lot of finagling behind closed doors. I didn't have a real issue with people lying to me, and it's a tribute to the politics we have.
And to the respect they had for you.
The what?
And the respect they had for you, yeah.
Yeah. The respect. Yeah, the respect they had for the Globe.
Okay.
Wasn't me. I was the Globe. That was important. You always learn. Some reporters thought it was always about them. No, you're the Globe, and that's why they're talking to you.
That's gorgeous. That's a wonderful distinction.
You're not, yeah. But I never had a serious issue of lying, and because there was a good press corps at the State House, the Massachusetts State House. There was in the day 30 years ago. There were regional papers. There was the UPI, AP. There was the Herald had a big bureau. We had a big bureau. People were all over the State House. No one of any serious position was going to lie and get caught lying.
And get caught lying. My, how lovely. To be back in that world. What role do you all think AI, or as Linda McMahon, the chair of our soon-to-be extinct Department of Education, called it A1, I guess I could say it might suggest that she was into the sauce. Oh, wait. Couldn't resist a little pun. What role does now I'm not going to even be able to say it right. What role does AI play in discerning realities right now? I mean, it's really tough.
Yes, so
Touched on that, Danielle,
I
but
did a
can you
little.
focus on it a little bit for us?
Sure. I'm sure many of you saw the story the New York Times did in this past week or so with all of the AI fake images from the battlefield, which they published with the red line across them. So that's helpful, right? Because that's interesting.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
It
Yeah.
shows you how the news media is going to start to try to cover AI and how they're going to try to distinguish, what they're producing and their grounds for verifying things from AI-generated images. Ultimately, probably we will end up in a world where images need to be marked with the sort of a kind of an accredited token of an issuer who's an accredited issuer of images. And that's how we'll start to be able to sort of sort out clean from unclean images. Some of that's already happening in Taiwan. There are parts of the world that are farther ahead than we are in terms of the kind of technological solutions to this problem. But yes, I mean, at this point, AI is exceptionally good. It would fool everybody in this room. So we all have to essentially proceed on the assumption that unless we can validate the provenance of something, we actually have no idea what it is.
It is curiouser and curiouser, isn't it? I hate to go into the world thinking this may not be true. I'd much rather go into the world believing that something is true. Frank, these weren't issues when you were writing for the Globe, were they?
No, I left about 6 years ago. It really wasn't AI. I'd never even heard of AI. You went to the internet and find out things, and you had to be careful there, but not AI.
But not AI.
Yeah, no.
So when you read the Globe, and today, and when you're reading it and looking what they're doing, and you see their pictures, do you ever blink twice and wonder what the source is and whether it's an accurate portrait?
See their pictures,
Yes,
their photos?
photos. Yep, I should have said photos. Sorry, not pictures.
I've never done that, and I don't think the Globe would,
would
would do that.
Yeah,
I
would.
mean, they're very, very ethical in what they do. Thank
Ethical
God we have some semblance of the Globe. It's very disappointing to see the Globe these days, but I think it's transitioned to the internet very well. It's got a good web page. And,
It does have a good webpage.
Yeah.
I
and
agree.
Hopefully it'll be able to continue.
Continue that kind of clarity. Should the federal government be involved in adjudicating the late night talk shows? We watched what we watched what happened several times, but most recently with Stephen Colbert, who had the kind of guts, the courage to say, they told me not to do this, but look, I'm doing it anyway. To kind of step out in the middle of that complexity and really to kind of honestly address it and to say, despite being forbidden, I did it. Despite struggling with truth, I did it. I wasn't going to let that kind of stand in my way. Where can you think of, in your mind, is there a line that discerns kind of free speech from abuse of the airways?
So, I mean, this is back to your opening remarks, this question about licenses being held in the public interest. And then, of course, public interest is an innocuous term until it gets into the hands of the wrong person, right? And that's sort of the world we find ourselves in now. If we compare the backsliding in democracies around the globe, Hungary and Turkey, for example, to the US, what happened in Hungary was very much a story of the consolidation of power over the media by Viktor Orban. That is absolutely what is unfolding here as well. There were some important reports earlier this week, actually, from some of the nonprofits that have been tracking democratic backsliding around the globe and over time, and so for the first time have registered the United States as worse off than Hungary and Turkey. So, yeah, so folks should be aware of that. And this consolidation of control over the media is an important aspect of that. So, no, we need to be able to protect civil society, media, universities, the like. That does mean that we need all of those entities to be willing to stand up and fight. It's hard. Some are, some aren't, as you all know. Some law firms folded, some fought. They were recently the ones that fought were vindicated by judicial decisions. So that's positive, that's good news. Similarly, sort of in the university domain, some have stood up, some have not. So far, the courts have been validating and vindicating the universities that are standing up and fighting to the effort to control civil society. So the same thing really now in the media landscape. There, unfortunately, the media landscape has been more willing to give way than either the law firms or universities. But we need all three of those sectors to stay strong. So then that's the hard question of sort of what are the sources of strength for media, for universities, for law firms under conditions of really aggressive intervention.
Aggressive intervention, that's such a powerful concept, and particularly in light of your wonderful comment, Frank, about democracy. We rely on the Fourth Estate for truth, to keep us on a straight path. The wonderful phrase, which I think has been dropped from the Washington Post, that democracy dies in darkness, which is very sad that it was dropped, because in fact that was the point, wasn't it?
Well, I think this is an important point, that it's under fire. We're under the First Amendment, and our news media and our general media and talk shows, because it's making us think of what we have and what we value. And there's a good debate. Hopefully the debate comes out on the side of the First Amendment and freedom of speech. But it does make us think about it and talk about it, have forums like this talking about it.
To try to work that out.
Right, to understand it a lot better and clarify. We took it for granted so many years.
Yeah.
There was this good First Amendment win just this past couple of days. I'm sure you all saw that,
Yes.
right?
Go.
That the Pentagon's prohibitions on news journalists' presence, the taking away of some of their press passes, was ruled unconstitutional. So again, the courts actually have stood strong, and that is a thing that we should all recognize. I know there are lots of complaints about the Supreme Court right now, and it's a complicated body, but it is actually standing strong. And the Trump administration is actually, by and large, adhering to judicial rulings. So that is the one sort of positive piece in our story at the moment.
And that's one to hold on to. Not to be blinded by, but to hold on to. Chairman Carr argues that the Supreme Court gave the FCC extraordinarily broad authority. That's a quotation. Indeed, he is, according to the New York Times, and this is a citation, in the process of changing the rules, as he asserts that the rules describing ownership are arcane and artificial. What are the implications if various agencies around the government simply decide to change the rules? Is this a kind of acquiescence to a kind of fascism in our country?
Well, it's tough because lots of the rules are actually arcane. So, for example, the equal time rules around political spending do not map our actually functioning political landscape. And there are lots of other examples of that you can find in the regulatory structure. So for me, this is an area well beyond my expertise. So I'm sure there's somebody else with a better answer, and perhaps somebody in the room would have a better perspective. For me, this is a place, though, where Congress ought to be acting. Now, I say that even with a Republican majority in Congress now, which doesn't necessarily provide a lot of hope for a positive outcome. But the point I'm wanting to make there is that the kinds of regulatory changes that Carr is proposing to move forward, they may be within his authority as a independent agency and so forth. And that's where we get to the problem of the gap between the administrative state and congressional authorization. At the end of the day, for some of these choices or changes that will have great consequences for the functioning of our democracy, one wants Congress to be reviewing them again. So even if there's a Republican majority, at the very least, there are minority committee leaders who can raise questions, put the debate in the public eye, and so forth. When we are able to have genuine congressional engagement, we actually still, as a people, are able to get things done. The best evidence for that being the recent firing of Kristi Noem. That required lots of public advocacy, but then it required engagement from both parties in Congress. Although the Democrats were in the minority, there was a lot that they were actually able to do in terms of driving that conversation and that outcome. So I think some of these issues around media and regulation, we would be well served if we could get those actually into Congress for debate.
Well, congressional debate is Well, actually, does it exist? It's coming back. I think there's a
Sputters.
revivification, slowly but surely. Frank, do you have a response to that one?
How do I follow that?
Okay, I get
That's
it.
their expertise.
Yeah, yeah.
I wouldn't dare cut
What can we do? I mean, if we see things that are untrue, if we see things that are bothering us, letters to the editor, do they make any difference? Does our statement going forward have any influence on what's happening? What do you all think?
Yes, but,
And we're gonna come to
you
all
should
of
take
you.
this one first, since I went first on the last one.
on what we.
Do letters to the editor matter?
Yes.
Ought we to be
Absolutely,
writing them?
absolutely. And
Okay.
if they'll get published. Papers used to get a lot of letters, and they sort them out. But I do. I think I read them. It's good to read them. I understand what people are complaining about and what the voices are within the public. I think it's an important part of a newspaper to publish them, and I'm all for them. I hate to see them go.
Do you think in the Globe that that people sitting in this room, short of those people who have a certain kind of expertise to which folks would rather naturally bow, do you think it's easy for regular folks to get something into the
Well,
LTE?
it's a limited amount of space. And when I was working at the Globe, there was lots of people wanted to do it. The same with the New York Times. I mean, I've had friends here in Concord. I've written to the Times, they didn't do anything with it. And a few got in. But it's a very hard thing to be the editor of the editorial page, and particularly in charge of the letters, because it used to be that newspapers were inundated with those.
Right.
People wanted to put their voice into the paper. And perhaps there should be a bigger part of the paper given to it, but I think it's very important.
Well, I don't know whether many of you do this, but you can go down the rabbit hole and see that somebody's written an article, and then you can see what all the comments were. And I just find that I don't do it. I don't know who these people are. I don't know why they're saying what they're saying. I find it a little bit either discouraging or enlightening, but I don't find it a jolly trip, to go down in and see and see what's there. So if these things are signed, if there's a way of establishing the propriety of your speaking, which is only as a citizen with dignity. It's a hard thing sometimes to sort out, isn't it? Danielle, what do you think?
I think letters to the editor are super important, and even though few of them get published, I encourage everybody to keep writing them. Among other reasons, it's a way each of us just practices using our voice. I think when you take the time to write a letter to the editor, you are clarifying your own thoughts, your own thinking. You may send it off to the papers, but then the odds are you'll also share those thoughts with your neighbor, or when you're in the grocery store and bump into somebody you know, or at a dinner party. So in that regard, it's a part of using our civic muscle. And I do think in a time when our greatest challenge is executive overreach, creeping authoritarianism, autocracy, the only antidote to that is literally the power of the people, self-government, free and equal citizens using their civic muscles. So every opportunity we have to actually just keep building our civic muscles, we should take, and letters to editor are really good for that.
As you might say, the loyal opposition.
The loyal opposition.
Danielle has written wonderfully about that. Let's take questions from the audience. We've got lots. Oh, I'm so glad we've got so many.
Yeah, thanks. Jane Hotchkiss, and thank you, Danielle. This is your second lecture here that I've had the pleasure of listening, and thank you, Frank. My question is the huge, huge shadow that hasn't been talked about. I grew up in a magazine publishing family, and I learned before I could talk that there was an absolute line between editorial and money, always.
Right.
And that the value of your paper was its voice, and if you cross the line, that voice was gone. Well, I see a world right now where money has taken, money of a very few individuals is rapidly owning everything. So I don't want to take away from any of your thoughts, all of which I love. How do we possibly combat AI that's already owned, bots, because what you could respond to before, most of them are not even human.
Right.
So there's nobody there to answer the question. I mean, it's a beautiful voice and it's a muscle that we all need to exercise. What do we do?
Who wants to take that?
I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, it feels, this moment feels overwhelming. You look at Elon Musk's power and authority and concentration of wealth, the fact that, he just made a battlefield call in the Ukrainian-Russian battlefield. Thank heavens for the side of Ukraine this time. His last battlefield call went for the side of Russia, right? But the notion that that is where decisions are being made is appalling. Or, Jeff Bezos in the Washington Post. I resigned from the Post at the point when he pulled the endorsement of Kamala Harris. So yes, it's a hard moment that we're in. I keep chipping away at grassroots renovation for our democracy, and including in policy areas whose purpose is to rein in the power of tech. So for example, in Utah, Governor Cox passed a great bill called the Digital Choice Act, I believe, which gives people ownership over their own data, requires interoperability and data portability. It basically breaks the lock that any of the platform companies or AI companies can have on users. And that actually shifts the balance of power, including in terms of what they can do from a regulatory point of view. And so I think, there are policies like that we actually need to achieve at the national level. And the only way we are going to actually do that, win that, is with grassroots work that wins electoral victories all over the place, state level and federal level, and then driving advocacy changes in Washington. So it's the same answer that there ever was. People have to be the counterpoint to that concentrated power of money. It's not a tomorrow answer. It is like a 2-year answer and a 4-year answer. I don't think it takes 10 years for us to change the basic dynamics around that if we can actually build that grassroots movement.
If we can define it, recognize it, and build it. Frank, do you want to add to that, or please do?
How could I add anything?
Well, there are moments when we can, and there are moments when we just defer graciously. Charles.
Well, my question was going to be, in fact, in the vein of what was just asked here. In terms of the ownership of the media, which is something that you've addressed, we've seen this huge concentration now towards all of these basically Trump-supporting billionaires taking over stuff that was more in the political center and all of that. And in terms of what we can do, should we be looking at opposing those people directly and calling them out directly? And I mean, having a No Kings March being an anti-Paramount takeover of CNN march or things in that nature, because those people haven't been targeted, and they might be, I think, quite sensitive to that potentially.
It is a problem. I see it in the newspaper world. The Boston Herald doesn't even have an office in Boston now. The Lowell Sun doesn't have there's no office in Lowell. The reporters I talk to, the columnists, that they talk to somebody in Indiana who edits their column.
Closer.
Sorry. So it's a difficult question about what is it we can do about it, right? Is that your question? What could we do about it, or?
No, well, the question is, in terms of what we can do about it, should we be going directly after the owners?
Oh, go after the owners.
New owners who are warping these things towards right, because they're not getting direct contact with criticism, in fact.
Well, that's true. I mean, the owners of the Lowell Sun lived in Lowell and heard the feedback. The Taylor family in Boston, who owned the Globe, that feedback. I see the point you're making. There's nothing you could do. They're so insulated. I mean, how are you going to get to? How do you get to Murdoch? I actually worked for the Murdoch Herald at one point. I never saw him around there, but so I couldn't get to him. But it's a very difficult thing. Papers, these guys are owning the papers and are not held accountable for it.
It's kind of like Sinclair News. Who's Sinclair? I mean, how do we, how do we, if you're in a car and you're driving cross country, one of the few things you might be able to pick up on the radio is Sinclair News. What is that teaching you, and what do you know? 2 seconds, Kate. Good over here to Lana.
Thank you. thank you both for being here and to everyone else who's here, because this is what we have to do. We have to show up. So thank you for that. With regard to your question, because I was also thinking before you mentioned yours the same thing in terms of policy. But there is an effort. It's called Resist and Unsubscribe. I don't know if you've heard of it. I don't know how well it's done. The person who started it is Scott Galloway. But look it up, Resist and Unsubscribe, and it's specifically targeting Amazon, all of these organizations. And, you know, again, it's one effort to target the people who are behind this. So just wanted to mention that. Also, you know, Danielle, you talked about policy, the 3 buckets that we have to focus on. Absolutely. You talked about policy, and I think this issue of money in politics is enormous, writ large. And I want to have a clearer sense of what we can do. We have Jeff Clements, who's in Concord. We also have Larry Lessig, who feels that, you know, not a constitutional amendment, but a different approach. He has a different approach. In fact, I would like to have him here to present as well. I mean,
was here a while ago, and we're going to bring him back.
excellent, and maybe with Clements.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, that's what I'm interested in. How do we finally get to that? Because if we don't do that, I don't see how. I mean, it is just chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. I don't have enough years left to keep chipping away. So, any thoughts?
No, I agree.
Lana, may you have many years. You're a gem. Go ahead.
Yes, I agree. I think the point about money in politics is very important. I find it helpful to recognize our age as essentially the second Gilded Age. And I mean, sort of levels of inequality and concentration of wealth are on par with that period of time, as well as related social strife, issues around labor, workers' rights, racial strife, things like that. There are lots of parallels between the end of the 19th century, the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. But the other reason that that is a useful frame, at least for me, is because the Gilded Age yielded the era of progressive reform. Women got the right to vote, we got direct election of senators. You can go down the line of the kinds of reforms that came through in that period of time that were a kind of modernization of American democracy for the 20th century. So I believe that we are on the cusp of another period of modernization of American democracy. Now this time, for the 21st to 22nd century. So what that means is there's not a single silver bullet. There are actually a bunch of things that we have to do all together as a package, essentially. The campaign finance, the money and politics reforms are absolutely critical. I'm both and on Jeff's ballot, his constitutional amendment, and Larry Lessig's measures to block foreign funds in our elections. And there have been efforts. There is a bill in the Massachusetts legislature right now on that one. Something that you could all do, in addition to writing letters to the editor, you can submit testimony to the legislature, which you can actually now do online through a platform called MAPLE, the Massachusetts Platform for Legislative Engagement. There are bills on the money and politics piece, and I can't remember the sponsors right now. I can try to track them down and send to Diane to send around, but you should send in testimony on those bills. Put, some heat and energy around that. Because, I mean, the good news is that for some of the money and politics and stuff, we can actually make a difference at the state level. So we don't have to wait to change the dynamics on the federal level to get changes through. So do it in the state now, in Massachusetts. Minnesota's done it, Maine's done it. We can kind of build a coalition of states that are doing it. But then again, that brings me back to the frame of the progressive era, right? It took, 25 years to get a whole slew of those reforms through. So we need to do it. We need to take every little step that we can now, but knowing that we're doing it along a 25-year arc where we won't all get to see the fruits of the whole victory. But that whole victory will never come unless we are taking our little step right now.
I'll be over there next.
Hello. I'm standing because I want y'all to see the T-shirt. Hope y'all have your plans for next Saturday. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on this grim Sunday afternoon and sharing your expertise. And you have so much expertise in press and truth and whatever, but I also noticed that you share a passion for the State House. And you just did address that a bit. But could you speak more to the state of our State House and how we can elevate that among our citizenry and maybe address it? Thank you.
It's difficult. There has to be some passionate issue. That's what I've seen the State House really rock. Gay marriage, oh my God, it just overtook the State House every day. It was people rolling in. Some of you are old enough to remember the House Cut bill. And people, poured into the League of Women Voters. I think one of the speakers called it the League of Women Vultures. And that's how they were treated.
Oh, how
when
charming.
They came to the State House. But there have been, these very positive things that gripped the state legislature, and it used to be a very vibrant place to be. When I go there now, in the middle of the week, anytime, you could roll a ball down the hallways and you wouldn't hit anybody. Nobody is in the State House. And I don't know, it's because there's no great issue at stake anywhere. But when I came into journalism, the State House was vibrant, debating every day, and there were people, crowds up in the galleries, and there were lobbyists all over the place. It was a very vibrant place. And today, it's as dead as can be. Three people run it: the House, Senate, and the Senate, and House leaders, and the governor. And they make up the decisions. A lot of legislators are voting from home electronically. There's just not there's not a democracy there anymore.
That is it's so interesting about voting at home, because Concord, for those of you who live in Concord, will be facing the question about whether we want remote participation in town meeting, which is kind of voting from home. And some will say yes. Oh, David, of course you're going to say yes. And others will be more cautious. But I mean, this is an ongoing question. And if it deadens the place, that's an interesting issue. Danielle, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to add to that. I mean, yes, we have a very inactive State House. We do have urgent, pressing issues in the Commonwealth: housing, transportation issues, immigration questions. Can we actually establish protections against ICE's overreach? Other states have moved faster than we have in actually establishing formal protections, protecting due process and things like that. We have a 2-year salaried legislature that passes less legislation than any other state house in the country, most of which don't have 2-year full-time salaried legislatures, okay? So we have to take a look at the question of, are we getting our money's worth as taxpayers from our legislature? Are they actually doing the work on the urgent issues? There are 4 ballot initiatives on the ballot for November, all of which have the purpose of giving us a real democracy in our state house again. So there's one that is about stipend reform for the state legislature. Currently, their compensation, in addition to their full-time salary, they get extra amounts that the speakers and the Senate President and the Speaker get to determine, which is why only 3 people control everything that happens in the State House, because they control all the salaries. And committee chairs are getting stipends for committees that never meet, never hold hearings. It's really a scandal. You really should pay attention to this one. It's literally like what the situation was with King George III in Parliament in 1776, okay? Where he had half of Parliament in his pocket through stipends, essentially. So there's that one, to clean that up so that it's a reasonable system, so people can still get stipends for doing real work, etc. There's a Public Records Act ballot initiative as well, so that we can actually have, on par with other states, access to documents through Freedom of Information requests, which currently we can't. Then there's the all-party primary ballot initiative that I mentioned, to make sure that, right now we have very little competition. In 2024, 60% of our legislators ran unopposed completely. They had no competition at all. So we have fewer competitive elections than any state in the country. So that is a measure to change that and get competitive elections again. And then same-day voter registration, so that communities that have less housing stability in particular can still get to vote on Election Day by registering with a new address right on Election Day.
The Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post pretty much appear to be fully captured editorially by the Trump administration. Matter of fact, when you read an editorial, it looks like it's been written by somebody who works for Trump. by some of his cabinet people, some of his analysts, what have you. And I guess the question is, what do these papers really stand for at the end of the day? The papers, have opinion. Opinion is what they are. I don't know what else they are other than what they say. And, I guess the question is what do we do? Do we continue to support them? Or do we dump our subscriptions and look for another means of gathering news and hope that the people that work there end up in independent news medias? So that's the question.
Now, sorry, just to check, were you asking about all of the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal? Were you asking about those three ones specifically, or?
I'm asking about Wall Street.
The Wall Street Journal specifically.
Wall Street Journal and Washington Post.
If you read you get into a Washington Post editorial, and you're reading this editorial, and it's like, what is this?
Yeah.
What am I reading here? This is not only nonsense, it looks like it's written by a fifth grader. And it turns out that, it's analyst stuff from the White House. And the same, both these papers are pretty much lined up, and I've just canceled my subscriptions to these. I can't stand to put up with them. Now, was that the right move? I don't know, but I have, same with CBS. I'm not going to watch CBS anymore either. So there you go. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I don't know whether that's the right thing, but it's where I'm at.
Got it. So I don't read the Washington Post anymore, so I've made that same choice as you. I mean, I can only speak to my own choice on that one. I do read the Wall Street Journal. I find it still useful to read. I find its news coverage is actually quite good. And it's, in terms of its editorials and opinion pages, I mean, their approach to this question that Diane asked earlier was, I mean, they have what they call a balls and strikes approach. They say, we'll call the strikes and the balls honestly. And they do actually, I mean, they do write critical things about the Trump administration as well as writing things that are positive about the Trump administration. So I consider, I mean, they certainly have a point of view. They're conservative and they're doing their best to support the Trump administration whenever they can. But they will call strikes, and they are, how to put it, if you want to understand what the best possible case is for what the Trump administration is doing, then reading the Journal is the best way to understand that, which I think is useful. Like, one wants to know what the best possible case is as one is thinking about what one's own point of view is.
I make myself listen to the Washington Journal editorial podcast, so that I can hear, the other point of view.
Danielle, maybe you can answer this question. I think we have to really look at the traditional media and realize that it's changed, that it's been totally undermined by the internet. I mean, I read the New York Times morning newsletter every morning, and they have the most clicked article, right? And it could be, I bought this house in North Carolina. It could be a recipe. And by the way, I love Sam Sifton. But the reporters are rewarded by how many clicks they get on their stories. So everybody is writing for clicks. And then, you go to the White House, and they're, taking out these banger memes that are Call of Duty, whatever. I mean, it's all click-based, right? So, I wouldn't waste my time writing a letter to the editor. I would take a story that I really want to get more clicks on, put it up on my Facebook post, and try and drive it that way. I mean, I just think traditional media doesn't exist anymore. It's all been turned on its head. And it's all about, how do you turn it into entertainment? How to get people to, and the Republicans are really, really good at this. They're better than the Democrats at this. And getting people to tune in, whether it's Call of Duty or whatever they're doing, to get people's attention. It's entertainment,
Yeah.
It's social media or die, right? That's where the dialogue really is taking place. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, 100%. And I think, sharing things that you think are worthy on your Facebook page or any other social media page is a good way of contributing. I think when yes, I take the point about letters to editor feeling like a waste of your time and energy. I mean, they certainly are if what you're concerned about is influence, right? That's not the way to get influence. Your path is a better way to get influence. I think I'm trying to connect the concept of voice and the concept of influence We all need spaces for practicing our voice. And so in that regard, letter to the editor as a genre, I think is a good way of working out one's thoughts. And in that regard, I suppose the one thing I would say about the sort of posting on social media is that I think we all need a certain kind of interruption of this, clickbait kind of dynamic. And we all need it just sort of for the sake of our own capacities of attention, our own mental health, and so forth. I mean, as we all know, the algorithms are designed for addictive properties. And they are damaging our mental health. So Jonathan Haidt is great on this. If you haven't read his Anxious Generation, you should read that book. So in that regard, take letter to the editor as more of a metaphor, for sort of a moment of personal reflection. And then I think there are a million things you can do with that personal reflection, right? And one can engage with social media and so forth, but recovering the space for personal reflection, personal voice development is, I just think, a hugely important need for all of us right now.
Well, we all need to practice, don't we, in learning how to articulate effectively whatever point of view it is that we have and expressing it, persuasively or thoughtfully. Mark.
Hi, I was born and raised in the state of Ohio, and since coming east many years ago, I've always been Ohio. It's west of New Jersey. That's all you really need to know. Ever since coming east many years ago, I've been aware that one source of mistrust of the media, especially the legacy traditional media, is the fact that it's concentrated on the coasts. And in fact, so much of our culture, I think of like night talk shows, for example, or humor shows, are concentrated on the coasts. And if you look at the electoral map, you can see that Democratic-leaning states are largely on the coasts, and the middle of the country is largely red on those maps. So I'm wondering, is anything being done, should anything be done, to somehow elevate and amplify the voices and perspectives of people elsewhere?
Yes, and a lot. So we've been talking mostly about all of the dismal news in the media landscape. There is positive news too. There are a lot of kind of grassroots philanthropy-based journalism startups. So the most famous is the Texas Tribune in Texas, which is a high-quality entity. It's purely philanthropy-based, so it's sort of a different business model for journalism. New Bedford has one now called the New Bedford Light, which is developing and I think is getting positive responses. There are others as well in the South that I know of. So there is a sort of network of new growth that's starting. It does take a different model. So people are working on kind of regional collaborations for the back office part of a newsroom so that nobody has to rebuild a whole newsroom, so that you can do it that way, and then you sort of are raising money to cover your local community and the like. So that's one thing. Another thing that I'll throw out for you, again, is I try always, everywhere I go, to recruit people into the work of democracy renovation, which again is at the state level, but it's also at the federal level. We could really, really, really use and benefit from an increase to the size of the House of Representatives. I know that sounds completely crazy, but more members of Congress would actually help in a lot of ways if what we could also do is reintroduce what used to exist in some places, multi-member districts, and then use ranked choice voting with those multi-member districts. That would give you proportional representation in Congress. And what that would actually do is get rid of the red-blue map. Every state would have mixed delegations. You'd be mostly red in Ohio, but there'd be a blue member of your delegation, et cetera. And what that would mean is that in Congress, when the two parties caucus, currently, Jamie Raskin writes about this in his most recent book, when the two parties caucus, when Republicans caucus, there's nobody from the coasts in the room. When the Democrats caucus, there's nobody from the middle of the country in the room. So they both have a very partial picture of what's going on in the country. If we could have proportional representation in Congress, then both caucuses would have all the geography covered. And getting that national conversation knit together again would actually start to drive the media conversations back together again.
David Pepper, of course, from Ohio, who's fantastic. If you want to know what's going on in Ohio, just channel David Pepper, because he is, do you all know him? Have you all looked at his blog or paid attention to him? He has a lot to teach us nationally, you know, as well as in terms of Ohio. We have a question online.
This is a question from online. What steps would you advise activist-rich communities to take when their local news sources set a policy for the sake of not seeming biased to report any news, to not report any news or local events, or even publish opinions and letters to the editor that they determine to be political?
Oh, man. Sorry. Has that happened? I'm so sorry. Wow. That's a big deal. I'm so sorry. Gosh. Well, I mean, that sounds like a cause for some grassroots activism in Concord. So yeah, I'd say get organized. Get organized. You know, cancel subscriptions, boycott until they can have a better. It's free? Oh, okay. Got it. All right. Well, then I would start hosting some public debates on the question. I would run a series of public debates to hammer out alternative policy. As a town, I would run a deliberative assembly process to generate alternative policies for the entity and then present them to them and then put pressure on them to adopt them.
Of course, they do cover local politics, very, very local. But anything that kind of nudges like a pseudopod of an amoeba outside that very narrow constraint, then they don't.
Yeah, try to help them do better. That's how I would go at it, actually. Say, we appreciate the effort, and here's a better policy.
We've been working on that. David, and then Janet, and then those will be our last questions. David.
So I come from a state west of Ohio, Indiana, along with my neighbor, Mark. My bum leg kept me from getting in here to hear the beginning, but I'm going to take a shot that you haven't been here yet. I hope that's right. A puzzle, back, as it were, to thinking about, as it were, theory. How we divide free speech from hate speech, which incidentally gets us, sorry, not yelling loud enough, sorry about that. How do we divide free speech from hate speech, which gets us into a practical question about social media. We obviously have a very serious problem, not just hate speech, but fake speech and so forth and so on, which then gets us off into the question of the fractionation, as somebody's already brought it up here, of our news sources so that we don't talk a common language, we don't see three networks every night as we did when I was growing up as a kid and some of the rest of us in here. I'm not sure which of those you'll find fruitful, but I invite you to take on one of them, particularly the business about hate speech, since I'm puzzled by it. Thanks.
I think trying to deal with hate speech when you're a reporter or a journalist, is that the question you have, essentially?
I'm thinking about policy-wise.
Policy-wise?
Where do we come out? Obviously, free speech is essential. You can't speak your mind. We live in an autocracy. On the other side of it, that leads some people to taking advantage of saying hateful things and actually committing them, for example.
And the question is, how do you handle that?
How do you handle, how do you draw a line between hate speech and freedom of press, freedom of speech?
Well, it is tough. It's a tough question, but yeah, it's common sense, I think. It's, you know what, when you see it. And I think, you know, I know as a reporter, you'd be interviewing somebody and they, you know, say something very vile about another person. You obviously knew, you know, you couldn't use it, but it is also gradations of that. How far can you go and how far you can't go, and then you talk it over with your editor. That's the best thing to do because you don't get fully blamed for it.
So, I mean, I think I would add a few things there. The first is we actually have a lot of legal categories that are helpful for establishing that distinction. So harassment, defamation, libel, incitement. There's a whole long actual list of kinds of speech that are not, in fact, protected by the First Amendment. And most of the stuff that's problematic does actually fall under those buckets. The challenge is always having those be actionable things. And so that's where social media presents a certain kind of problem. Because, so for example, I used the phrase earlier, probably went by really fast, stochastic harassment. So stochastic harassment is when, for example, Charlie Kirk says something about me on Fox News, and what he says about me is defamatory. I might or might not do anything about it because it's a royal pain to sue, et cetera, et cetera. But even though that's all he does, then like there's a bunch of other people who give me death threats. And it's not known in advance who's going to be producing those death threats. But there is a guarantee at this point, like the way Fox News works, there is a guarantee that if some people say certain kinds of things, other people get death threats. It's just like literally 100% guarantee. And so it's that sort of role that platforms are playing of converting speech that might be on the margin, on the bubble in terms of, is it protected or not, and would you sue or not, into something that is absolutely illegal. And figuring out how to actually have an actionable cause, a cause of action against those platforms, is where the legal work needs to be done. It's within the realm of the possible. There's a bunch of different legal categories that would make those things causes of action. And so that's the question, I think, now, is like whether or not we can actually make that happen.
Thank you so much. Janet, you get the last question.
I'm honored. I was wondering if you... Sorry. Okay, I was wondering if you could speak more about Substack and similar platforms, alternate platforms that are popping up. For about the last year and a half, I get up in the morning and I listen to Heather Cox Richardson, then I listen to Robert Hubble zip through the news, then I go to the Washington Post, which I'm going to junk pretty soon when a subscription runs out, to see what Bezos thinks Trump wants to hear. Then I go to the New York Times and I read it because Trump doesn't like it and slams it occasionally, and they have some various good articles occasionally. Then I read the Boston Globe in chunks, because by then I've already read the national news. I want the regional stuff, and I read my local paper. Then half the day is gone. But I feel reasonably well informed. Anyway, this is nuts if you actually have a life to lead. But can you talk about Substack, or where does one get actual real news these days?
It's a great set of questions. I mean, I think your process is a good one. That is to say,
And then she takes a nap.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Having clarity about different sources and then what you're using for which purposes. So I'm similar to you in the sense, I basically use New York Times and the Wall Street Journal for news, and I read both of them because you do get a contrasting perspective there, and then that way you can triangulate and get more clarity about your own, perspective on things. So that, for sure. I will plug my Substack called The Renovator, which we focus very specifically on democracy renovation themes. So we will not get you all the news, but we are covering states and the ways in which states are trying to actually make forward progress on some of these improvements that we've been discussing today. So it's a little niche, for sure, but maybe every 2 weeks you could pop into The Renovator and pick a little up of sort of state content to go along with the rest of your content. But I think everybody probably has a slightly different answer to this question, but I do think being able to triangulate is the most important thing, actually. So don't limit yourself to one source, have a couple. Now, how about you? How do you approach getting news these days?
Pretty much what I heard there. My wife and I got the New York Times and the what do you call it, the Journal, and I get it in paper. I like paper, but I'm an old guy, and I like paper, and I do not like reading it on the screen. It really bothers me. So those two papers, plus I do read a lot of the Globe online. It's got a good
Well,
page,
there's some,
and it
yeah.
does well in its reporting. The Globe has come out of this. I was very worried about it when I left, and I think it's come out of it, and it's got a good editor now. Brian McGrory is an old pal of mine. He's terrific.
He's
and
terrific.
He's doing a good job.
As Mary McGrory was too.
Yeah, nephew.
a real favorite. You two are just so amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, just phenomenal. So before we go, just a simple comment. So I'm going to go back to Alice. Remember our friend Alice in Wonderland? The Cheshire Cat explains, I'm not crazy. My reality is just different from yours. Therein, of course, rests our struggle for truth. And when Alice pleads, would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? The Cheshire Cat replies, well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. Well, where we want to get to, I think, collectively, is a place of sanity, clarity, and truth. Even when it is uncomfortable or unsettling or contradicts our own knowledge or instincts. Thank you both for helping us figure out or begin to think very critically about where we want to get to and how perhaps to get there. As Lewis Carroll says, it takes, and this is what Janet is doing, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And he's one of the characters say this. And if you want to get somewhere else, you must run twice as fast as that. So let us run twice as fast to recover what we all once knew as a time of honest, plain truth. And may that happen sometime in our, Lana, while we're all still kicking around up here on this side of the soil. I also want to just say that some thank yous that are really critical. Linda and Nancy Confrey, Linda Ziffern and Nancy Confrey covered all of this stuff in the back. Arkady has been doing all the filming on a Sunday afternoon, so Arkady, we are so grateful. Minuteman Media Network is just brilliant, and we are so lucky. I want to thank the library in this gorgeous room, in which we sit. And last but not least, I want to thank Alice Kaufman, not a different Alice. In fact, it was your name, Alice, that led me to start thinking about Alice in Wonderland. Alice Kaufman for helping us put together this forum and gathering the wonderful folks who are here. There's so much food in the back. Have some wonderful food and stay to talk to Danielle and to Frank. They have so much to offer us and so much to teach. Thank you all very much.